The annals of military history are filled with grand victories won through brilliant charges, clever flanking maneuvers, and overwhelming displays of force. Yet among the most sophisticated tactical innovations ever devised stands a maneuver that appears, at first glance, to be an admission of defeat: the organized withdrawal. For the Roman legions, the ability to retreat in perfect order was not a sign of weakness, but rather a demonstration of supreme discipline and tactical sophistication that transformed a potentially catastrophic rout into a deadly weapon capable of destroying overconfident enemies. The nature of ancient warfare. To understand the revolutionary nature of the Roman-controlled retreat, we must first comprehend the brutal reality of ancient combat. Battles in the classical world were not the coordinated affairs depicted in sanitized modern representations. They were chaotic, terrifying experiences where men stood shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, separated from their enemies by mere feet of blood-soaked ground. The noise was deafening. The clash of metal on metal, the screams of wounded men, the bellowing of orders that could barely be heard above the din. In this environment, the psychological dimension of warfare was paramount. Armies fought not as collections of individuals, but as cohesive units, and the moment that cohesion broke, disaster inevitably followed. When soldiers turned their backs to the enemy and began to run, the careful formation that had protected them dissolved. What had been an organized fighting force became a mob of panicked individuals, each concerned only with personal survival. Enemy cavalry and infantry would pursue these fleeing soldiers, cutting them down from behind with terrible efficiency. Historical accounts consistently show that the majority of casualties in ancient battles occurred not during the fighting itself, but during the pursuit of routed forces. This reality made retreat one of the most dangerous operations any ancient army could attempt. The natural human instinct when facing mortal danger is flight, and once that instinct took hold of a formation, it spread like wildfire. Soldiers who moments before had stood firm would suddenly break and run, and their panic would infect their comrades. Even the most experienced warriors could fall victim to this contagion of fear. The line between an orderly withdrawal and a catastrophic rout was razor-thin, and most armies of the ancient world lacked the training, discipline, and command structure necessary to walk that line successfully. The Roman military machine. The Roman military system was fundamentally different from those of their contemporaries and predecessors. While other ancient powers relied on citizen militias that assembled for specific campaigns or on professional forces organized around individual commanders, Rome developed a military institution that was both professional and systematically structured. The Roman legion was not simply a collection of armed men, but a carefully organized machine with standardized training, equipment, command hierarchy, and tactical doctrine. At the heart of Roman military excellence was an unprecedented emphasis on discipline and training. Roman soldiers underwent rigorous and continuous training that went far beyond teaching them how to fight. They learned to march in formation, to respond instantly to commands signaled by horns and standards, to maintain their positions in the battle line regardless of circumstances, and to trust implicitly in their fellow soldiers and their officers. This training was not a brief period of preparation before deployment, but an ongoing process that continued throughout a soldier's service. The physical conditioning of Roman soldiers was equally impressive. They were required to march long distances in full equipment, to construct fortified camps at the end of each day's march, and to maintain their weapons and armor to exacting standards. This combination of physical fitness, technical skill, and psychological conditioning created soldiers who could perform complex maneuvers under the most stressful conditions imaginable. The command structure of the Roman legion enabled the kind of coordination necessary for sophisticated tactics. Centurions, the backbone of the Roman officer corps, were experienced soldiers who had risen through the ranks and commanded the absolute loyalty of their men. They served not only as tactical leaders, but as enforcers of discipline and exemplars of Roman military virtue. Above the centurions stood the tribunes and legates, officers typically drawn from the aristocracy who provided strategic direction and coordination between units. This hierarchy was reinforced by a sophisticated system of signals and standards. The legionary standards, the aquila or eagle that represented the entire legion, along with the various signa that marked individual cohorts and centuries, served as rallying points and communication devices. In the chaos of battle, when verbal commands could not be heard, soldiers looked to these standards to understand what was required of them. The loss of a standard was considered a catastrophic disgrace precisely because it represented the loss of this critical communication link. The mechanics of controlled retreat. The Roman controlled retreat was a complex tactical maneuver that required precise execution and perfect coordination. Unlike the panicked flight that characterized the collapse of most ancient armies, the Roman withdrawal was a deliberate operation conducted in stages, with different units performing specific roles in a carefully choreographed sequence. The first element of a successful retreat was the creation of a screening force. When Roman commanders decided to withdraw, they did not simply order their entire army to turn and march away. Instead, they designated specific units, typically the most experienced and disciplined troops, to maintain contact with the enemy while the rest of the force began its withdrawal. These screening units would maintain their formation, continuing to present a credible threat to the enemy while gradually giving ground. The key to this screening action was the alternating withdrawal of subunits. Roman formations were organized into smaller tactical elements that could operate semi-independently while maintaining overall cohesion. During a retreat, one line of soldiers would hold their position, maintaining their shields and presenting an unbroken front to the enemy. Behind them, another line would begin withdrawing, marching backward or turning and moving to the rear in carefully controlled movements. Once this second line had moved a certain distance, they would halt and reform, creating a new defensive position. The first line would then pass through them, taking up position further to the rear, and the process would repeat. This leapfrogging technique allowed the Romans to maintain constant pressure on any enemy attempting to pursue, while ensuring that there was never a moment when the entire force had its back turned to the threat. It required extraordinary discipline from the soldiers, who had to resist the powerful urge to simply turn and run, trusting that their comrades would protect them during their own withdrawal phase. The spacing and timing of these movements were critical. Move too slowly, and the withdrawing force could be overtaken and destroyed. Move too quickly, and the formation would break down into a disorganized retreat that could easily become a rout. Roman training emphasized the importance of maintaining the proper cadence, with officers and standard-bearers setting the pace, and soldiers trusting in the system even when their instincts screamed at them to run. Cavalry and light infantry played crucial supporting roles in these operations. Roman or allied cavalry would position themselves on the flanks of the retreating force, protecting against enemy attempts to envelop the withdrawal and harrying any enemy units that pressed too aggressively. Light infantry, armed with javelins and other missile weapons, would fall back in front of the main body, using their mobility to slow enemy pursuit while remaining out of reach of hand-to-hand combat. The destination of the retreat was as important as its execution. Roman armies on campaign constructed fortified camps with remarkable regularity and skill. These camps, surrounded by ditches and palisades, could be erected in a matter of hours and provided a secure refuge for a withdrawing force. If a Roman army retreated to a previously prepared position, the dynamic of the battle could shift dramatically. Pursuing enemies would suddenly find themselves attacking a fortified position defended by troops who, moments before, had appeared to be fleeing in defeat. Psychological warfare through discipline. The psychological impact of a Roman-controlled retreat on their enemies cannot be overstated. For soldiers schooled in the conventions of ancient warfare, the sight of an enemy force withdrawing in perfect order was deeply unsettling. It violated their expectations and understanding of how battles were supposed to unfold. When an army retreated, it was supposed to dissolve into panic, providing an opportunity for easy slaughter and plunder. A force that withdrew while maintaining its formation and fighting capability presented an entirely different challenge. This psychological element was particularly effective against tribal or less disciplined opponents. Celtic warriors, Germanic tribesmen, and other enemies of Rome often fought with great courage and ferocity, but their tactical systems emphasized individual valor and aggressive offense rather than coordinated defense. When they attacked what appeared to be a retreating Roman force, they expected to encounter fleeing soldiers whom they could cut down with relative ease. Instead, they found themselves repeatedly attacking prepared positions, suffering casualties while the Romans withdrew to yet another defensive line. The frustration and confusion this generated could be devastating to enemy morale. Soldiers who had thought victory was within their grasp would begin to question what they were actually achieving. Were they winning, or were they being led into a trap? This uncertainty could cause cohesion to break down, with some warriors pressing forward aggressively while others held back, creating gaps and disorder in what should have been a unified pursuit. Roman commanders understood these psychological dynamics and exploited them ruthlessly. A controlled retreat could be used to draw enemy forces out of strong positions, to separate them from their own fortifications or support, or to exhaust them through repeated charges against prepared defensive lines. Once the enemy had been sufficiently worn down, their formations disrupted, their soldiers exhausted, their morale shaken, the Romans could suddenly halt their retreat and counterattack, often with devastating effectiveness. Historical examples and applications. The historical record provides numerous examples of Roman armies using controlled retreats to achieve tactical advantage. While detailed accounts of specific tactical maneuvers are sometimes difficult to verify, the pattern of Roman forces withdrawing in good order, then turning to defeat pursuing enemies, appears repeatedly in ancient sources. One instructive example comes from Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. Caesar's commentaries describe multiple instances where his legions, facing numerically superior Celtic forces, would conduct fighting withdrawals that transformed what appeared to be Roman defeats into opportunities for counterattack. In these engagements, the disciplined Roman formations would give ground under pressure, maintaining their cohesion while the pursuing Gauls became increasingly disorganized. At the critical moment, the Romans would suddenly turn and launch a coordinated assault against enemies who were scattered, exhausted, and unprepared for such a reversal. The Roman-Parthian Wars provide another context where controlled retreats proved essential. The Parthians were masters of mounted warfare, particularly their devastating combination of horse archers and heavy cavalry. Against such mobile enemies, Roman infantry needed to be able to withdraw under fire, reforming their lines to present shields against arrow volleys while preventing the Parthians from isolating and destroying individual units. The ability to retreat in formation while maintaining defensive capabilities was often the difference between survival and annihilation when facing Parthian tactics. During the civil wars that marked the end of the Roman Republic and the transition to the empire, controlled retreats became even more important. When Roman armies fought each other, both sides possessed similar equipment, training, and tactical knowledge. In these conflicts, the army that could maintain better order during movements, including retreats, often held a decisive advantage. The ability to reposition forces on the battlefield without losing cohesion was a crucial skill that separated superior commanders from mediocre ones. The technique was also valuable in siege warfare and urban combat. Roman forces assaulting fortified positions might need to retreat from walls after an unsuccessful attack, or to withdraw from occupied sections of a city when counterattacked. In these confined and chaotic environments, the ability to retreat in formation prevented what could easily have become massacres of disorganized troops trapped in narrow streets or against walls. Training and institutional knowledge. The Roman ability to execute controlled retreats was not the product of individual genius or battlefield improvisation. It was the result of systematic training that turned complex tactical maneuvers into ingrained reflexes. Roman soldiers practiced these movements repeatedly during their training, drilling the specific steps and formations until they became second nature. The training regimen included exercises where units would advance and retreat in response to commands, learning to maintain proper spacing and formation regardless of which direction they were moving. Soldiers learned to trust that the men behind them would maintain their positions, making it safe to turn their backs briefly during movement. They practiced the timing and coordination required for the leapfrogging technique, understanding both how to hold a position while others withdrew and how to withdraw while knowing that others held the line. This training was reinforced by the Roman military culture, which placed enormous emphasis on discipline, obedience to orders, and unit cohesion. Roman soldiers were taught that their individual survival depended on the collective discipline of their unit. A soldier who broke formation endangered not only himself, but all his comrades. This understanding created strong social pressure to maintain discipline even in the most terrifying circumstances. The institutional memory of the Roman military ensured that tactical knowledge, including the techniques of controlled retreat, was preserved and transmitted across generations. Experienced soldiers trained new recruits. Centurions who had learned these techniques from their predecessors taught them to the next generation of officers, and the overall tactical doctrine of the legions evolved gradually while maintaining core principles of discipline and coordinated maneuver. This institutional continuity gave Roman armies a crucial advantage over enemies whose military knowledge was more dependent on individual leaders. A Celtic or Germanic army might possess a brilliant commander who understood sophisticated tactics, but when that commander fell in battle or died of natural causes, much of that tactical knowledge could be lost. The Roman system ensured that tactical excellence was embedded in the organization itself, not dependent on individual genius. The broader strategic context. The Roman-controlled retreat must be understood not merely as a tactical technique, but as part of a broader strategic approach to warfare. Roman military doctrine emphasized the importance of preserving the army as a fighting force. Unlike some military cultures that glorified death in battle above all else, the Romans understood that a defeated army that maintained its cohesion and withdrew intact could refit, reinforce, and return to campaign. An army that was destroyed through rout and pursuit was lost forever. This strategic perspective influenced Roman tactical decisions at every level. Commanders were willing to give ground, abandon camps, or retreat from battles rather than risk the complete destruction of their forces. This was not cowardice, but sound military judgment based on an understanding that Rome's ultimate advantage lay in its ability to raise, train, equip, and field multiple armies over extended campaigns. The controlled retreat was an essential tool for implementing this strategy. It allowed Roman commanders to disengage from unfavorable tactical situations without losing their armies. A force that could retreat in good order could choose when and where to fight, refusing battle when circumstances were unfavorable and engaging only when advantages could be pressed. This flexibility was a tremendous strategic asset. The technique also supported Rome's logistical system. Roman armies depended on secure supply lines and fortified bases. When operating in hostile territory, the ability to withdraw to fortified positions allowed Roman forces to maintain their logistical infrastructure even when faced with tactical setbacks. An army that could retreat to a fortified camp could wait for reinforcements, reorganize its forces, and prepare for renewed operations without being destroyed in the field. Limitations and challenges. Despite its effectiveness, the controlled retreat was not a panacea, and Roman armies did not always execute these maneuvers successfully. The technique had inherent limitations and required specific conditions to work effectively. The most fundamental requirement was adequate space for maneuver. In confined terrain, narrow valleys, dense forests, or urban environments, the careful spacing and alternating movements required for a proper controlled retreat became extremely difficult or impossible. Roman forces caught in such terrain could find themselves unable to execute the tactical retreat they had trained for, potentially leading to disaster. The morale and experience level of the troops involved was also critical. While all Roman soldiers received training in these techniques, there was a significant difference between knowing the movements intellectually and being able to execute them under the enormous stress of combat. Veteran units with extensive combat experience were far more reliable in executing controlled retreats than newly raised legions or auxiliary forces with less training. Enemy capabilities also affected the viability of controlled retreats. Against opponents with superior cavalry or missile forces, the Romans could find themselves unable to break contact effectively. Highly mobile enemies could harass a retreating force continuously, preventing the Romans from establishing the stable defensive positions necessary for their leapfrogging technique. Parthian horse archers, for instance, could maintain pressure on retreating Romans from beyond the range of Roman javelins, inflicting steady casualties while remaining out of reach of counterattack. The condition and morale of the army at the moment retreat was ordered also mattered enormously. An army that had already been severely battered, that had suffered heavy casualties, or had its formations disrupted by intense combat, would find it much more difficult to execute a controlled withdrawal. The very circumstances that made retreat necessary, being under heavy pressure from the enemy, were the same circumstances that made coordinated retreat most difficult. Weather and visibility conditions could also interfere with execution. The signal system that coordinated Roman movements depended on soldiers being able to see their standards and officers. In poor visibility, whether from darkness, fog, dust, or smoke, maintaining formation and coordinating movements became much more challenging. Heavy rain could make terrain muddy and difficult to traverse, slowing movements and making it harder to maintain proper spacing. Evolution and legacy. The Roman system of controlled retreat evolved over the centuries as the legion itself evolved. The manipular legion of the Republic, with its division into hastati, principes, and triarii arranged in checkerboard fashion, was particularly well suited to controlled retreats, as the reserve lines could cover the withdrawal of forward elements. The reforms attributed to Marius, which reorganized the legion into cohorts of roughly equal capability, required adjustments to retreat tactics, but retained the fundamental principle of coordinated withdrawal in formation. As Rome faced new enemies and new tactical challenges, the specific techniques of controlled retreat adapted, while the core principles remained constant. Fighting against heavily armored cavalry, dense pike formations, or coordinated infantry armies required modifications to the basic doctrine. but the emphasis on discipline, unit cohesion, and coordinated movement persisted. The legacy of Roman tactical doctrine, including the controlled retreat, extended far beyond the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire, the direct continuation of the Roman state in the East, preserved and adapted Roman military techniques for centuries. Byzantine tactical manuals explicitly described procedures for conducting orderly withdrawals, showing clear continuity with earlier Roman practice. Medieval and Renaissance military theorists studied Roman tactics and sought to apply Roman principles to the warfare of their own eras. The challenges of maintaining cohesion and executing coordinated movements remained relevant, regardless of changes in weapons and armor. The fundamental insight that disciplined troops could turn apparent defeat into tactical advantage through controlled maneuver remained valid. The concept reached its fullest expression in the professional armies of the early modern period. As European states developed standing armies with standardized training and drill, they rediscovered the value of precise, coordinated movements on the battlefield. The elaborate drill manuals of the 17th and 18th centuries, which taught soldiers to maneuver in formation in response to commands, represented in many ways a return to Roman principles adapted to the age of gunpowder. Conclusion: the Roman-controlled retreat stands as one of the most sophisticated tactical innovations of the ancient world. It transformed what was normally an army's moment of greatest vulnerability, the decision to disengage from combat, into a potential weapon that could deceive, exhaust, and ultimately destroy overconfident enemies. The technique required a unique combination of systematic training, disciplined execution, capable leadership, and institutional support that only Rome among ancient powers could consistently provide. The controlled retreat exemplified the Roman approach to warfare more broadly. Where other military cultures emphasized individual heroism, emotional intensity, or numerical superiority, the Romans relied on organization, discipline, and systematic application of proven techniques. They understood that battles were won not by superhuman courage or divine favor, but by soldiers who could perform their assigned roles reliably under the most adverse conditions. This tactical capability provided Rome with enormous strategic flexibility. Roman commanders could take tactical risks knowing that even if situations developed unfavorably, their forces could disengage and preserve themselves for future operations. They could trade space for time, withdrawing from untenable positions to fortified camps where they could reorganize and await reinforcement. They could transform enemy successes into Pyrrhic victories, allowing opponents to advance while maintaining Roman combat power intact. The psychological dimension of the controlled retreat was perhaps as important as its purely tactical value. The ability to maintain perfect discipline while under attack, to withdraw in formation while less disciplined opponents dissolved into chaos, demonstrated Roman superiority in a visceral, undeniable way. Enemies might win individual engagements, but they could not break the fundamental cohesion and fighting spirit of the legions. This demonstration of discipline and capability had broader political implications, contributing to Rome's reputation for invincibility and discouraging potential challengers. Understanding the Roman-controlled retreat also provides insights into the nature of military excellence more generally. It demonstrates that in warfare, as in other complex human endeavors, systematic training and institutional capability often matter more than individual brilliance or technological advantage. The Romans did not possess superior weapons or dramatically better physical specimens than their enemies. What they possessed was a superior system for transforming ordinary men into effective soldiers and coordinating their actions on the battlefield. The lessons of the Roman controlled retreat remain relevant in modern military contexts. Contemporary military forces still must master the art of tactical withdrawal, learning to disengage from contact while maintaining unit cohesion and combat capability. The specific techniques have changed dramatically. Modern forces coordinate through radio communications rather than visual signals, and movement occurs at mechanized speeds rather than marching pace. But the fundamental challenges remain the same. Soldiers still must overcome powerful psychological pressures to maintain discipline during retreat. Commanders still must coordinate complex movements under stress, and armies still must preserve their fighting power even when tactical circumstances require giving ground. The Roman order that turned retreat into a controlled weapon thus represents more than a historical curiosity or an interesting tactical footnote. It exemplifies timeless principles of military organization and combat effectiveness. It shows how systematic training, rigid discipline, institutional continuity, and tactical sophistication can combine to create capabilities that transcend the sum of their parts. In the controlled retreat, we see the Roman military machine at its finest, not in the glory of victory charges, but in the grimmer, more demanding task of maintaining perfect order while withdrawing under fire, transforming apparent defeat into the foundation for ultimate triumph.